Hello and welcome to Frontrunner Motorsport. This weekend we have the running of the 68th New Zealand Grand Prix, a very important race in the junior formula calendar. So let's go back through the history books and look at every New Zealand Grand Prix winner ever. All of them from 1950 to 2024. This is going to be a three-part series, all coming out this week with the final part coming out after the final race of the 2024 Formula Regional Oceania season. That means the 2024 champion is going to be included, which with no previous winners entering in 2024 means that whoever wins will be the 50th different winner of the New Zealand Grand Prix. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and let's jump into the video. 1950 John McMillan. The first New Zealand Grand Prix winner was John McMillan 74 years ago. Despite the New Zealand Grand Prix starting at the same time as the first ever Formula 1 championship, it was and never has been part of Formula 1. John McMillan won in a Jackson Special in a field made up entirely of New Zealanders, with the exception of Australian Gary Coughlin, who took pole position in an MG and then didn't start the race due to engine issues. This was the only New Zealand Grand Prix to be held at the Oceania military base circuit. You'll notice I'm not talking much about John McMillan, and that's because he's a complete mystery. Apparently known for being a competent engineer and racing driver in the 1950s, the only thing I know for sure is he won the first New Zealand Grand Prix. 1954 Stan Jones. The second New Zealand Grand Prix was a few years after the first and was won by Australian Stan Jones in a Maybach 3800cc special. The German luxury line is not exactly known for their racing pedigree. It's a bit like entering a sailing contest in the Titanic. It just seems wrong on so many levels. Stan Jones won ahead of a slightly more international field with a few Australians and a couple of British drivers. He went on to win the Australian Grand Prix in 1959 and retired from motorsport as the money ran out, passing away at the age of 50 on his birthday. 1955 Prince Birabongsi Banudej Banuban. Also known as Prince Bira of Siam, an actual prince, the grandson of the king, who was the inspiration for the king in A King and I. That king. Well, Prince Bira was also a very talented race driver. Most of his success was pre-war in his cousin's White Mouse team, but he did take wins in non-championship races later and scored a couple of points finishes in Formula 1. His final racing season was 1955, which he started by winning the New Zealand Grand Prix. His Maserati held off the Ferraris of Peter Whitehead and Tony Gaze. After retiring from motorsport, Prince Bira competed in sailing at the Olympics in 1956 and 1960, and he is instrumental in deciding the Thai racing colours, and he has a circuit named after him in Thailand. 1956, 1959 and 1962, Stirling Moss. One of the legends of the sport, Stirling Moss won just about everything except a Formula 1 title. His first win in the New Zealand Grand Prix saw him beat the Ferraris of Peter Whitehead and Tony Gaze, who must have been sick of the New Zealand podium at this point. Moss won his 3 New Zealand Grand Prix for 3 different teams. His first in a Maserati 250F, his second in 1959 was in a Cooper, ahead of Jack Brabham and Bruce McLaren, and his third and final New Zealand win was in a Lotus in 1962. Moss is an incredible driver, and his name on the trophy boosts it in stature immensely. 1957 Reg Parnell. The man who was third on the first ever Formula 1 podium, Reg Parnell won Ferrari's first New Zealand Grand Prix, ahead of Peter Whitehead and Stan Jones. Tony Gaze didn't turn up in 1957, probably sick of the New Zealand Grand Prix. Actually, he had retired at the end of the year previous, but he and Peter Whitehead are the original Team Rockets of the motor racing world. Reg Parnell, on the other hand, did win the New Zealand Grand Prix, and it was his greatest success in motorsport in a collection of non-championship wins. He retired from racing soon after and led Aston Martin to success at Le Mans and set up his own Formula 1 team. 1958, 1960 and 1961, Jack Brabham. The first 3-time winner of the event was another legend of Grand Prix racing, 3 times champion Jack Brabham. This was before he set up his own team though, so he took all 3 of these wins in a Cooper. His first couple of wins were not the strongest fields of all time, but his 1961 win was special, beating Bruce McLaren, Graham Hill, Jim Clark, Denny Hulme and Stirling Moss amongst others. The first 3-time winner beating out Moss by a year, shame he never won a 4th with his own Brabham team. 1963, John Surtees. This would start a 2-year stretch of winning for John Surtees, who took his Lola Mark IV to victory ahead of some big names, sharing a podium with Angus Hislop and Jim Palmer. This was the first New Zealand Grand Prix to be held at Pukekohe, which is where a majority of the New Zealand Grand Prix have been held. A year later, he was winning the Formula 1 Championship for Ferrari, as well as finishing on the podium at Le Mans. He would take 6 Grand Prix wins in his 12-year career for Ferrari, Cooper and Honda, and would be the very first Can-Am champion in 1966, as well as running his own team in Formula 1. 1964, Bruce McLaren. Unbelievably, Bruce McLaren was the first Kiwi to win the New Zealand Grand Prix since the very first one 14 years earlier. He took his Cooper to victory ahead of Denny Hulme and Timmy Mayer, a very talented trio of drivers. This was the first time Ken Smith entered, although he failed to qualify. We'll get back to him later. For the first time, this race was part of the Tasman series, a short series held early in the year across New Zealand and Australia, with a fair few Formula 1 drivers taking part. Bruce McLaren also won the first Tasman in 1964. 2 years later, Bruce McLaren started his own team, just like Brabham and Surtees, and would take a win for his own team in Formula 1. Sadly, he was killed in a crash in 1970, but his legacy lives on with the McLaren team in Formula 1. 1965 and 1966, Graham Hill. Another Formula 1 legend, champion, and another who started his own team. Did you get a discount on spare parts if you won the New Zealand Grand Prix? Graham Hill was racing a Brabham for the Dave Mackay-owned Scuderia Veloce in 1965 and for BRM in 1966, ahead of teammate Jackie Stewart. This was also the first round of the Tasman series, which Graham Hill failed to win both times. In 1968, he won his second Formula 1 title, and followed that with a win at Le Mans and the Indy 500. He was killed in a plane crash in 1975. 1967, Jackie Stewart. Technically, he ran his own team much later and more through his son, but it almost counts. Sir Jackie Stewart is another who could be considered one of the greatest of all times, like most of the drivers on this list. Stewart took his BRM to victory ahead of 2 more British drivers, Jim Clark and Richard Atwood. Stewart would be the last British driver to win the New Zealand Grand Prix until Lando Norris took the crown 49 years later. Jim Clark dominated Stewart in the Tasman series, but Clark never won the New Zealand Grand Prix, one of the few things he didn't win at this time. Jackie Stewart would go on to take 3 Formula 1 championships and lead the way for safety in Formula 1, a majorly important player in what Formula 1 would become long after he retired from racing after 1973. 1968 and 1969, Chris Amon. As the 60s came to an end, another New Zealander stepped forward to take back the New Zealand Grand Prix from foreign invasion. The great Chris Amon took 2 wins in a row and the last for Ferrari, beating Pierre's Courage, Jochen Rindt and the future winner Frank Gardner. Amon would win 1 Tasman series as well in 1969. He is such a legend in New Zealand, he has a circuit named after him that has hosted a fair few runnings of the New Zealand Grand Prix. He never won a Formula 1 race despite coming close numerous times, but he did win at Le Mans and would continue racing in New Zealand up to 1975, still racing in Formula 1 at the time. 1970, Frank Matic. The first time the New Zealand Grand Prix was won by someone who wasn't nor never would be a Formula 1 driver since Stan Jones in 1954. Frank Matic was a very quick Australian who had taken a fastest lap in this race previously, quicker than the likes of Clark, Hill and Brabham. Frank beat Derek Bell and Graham Lawrence in his self-entered McLaren Chevrolet. The grid was a lot weaker than it had been in previous years, with far fewer stars of Formula 1 entering. He also won the Australian Grand Prix and had a lot of success in that part of the world. He retired from motorsport a few years after his win and was a successful businessman in Australia. 1971, Neil Allen. Beat the previous year's winner Frank Matic by just 0.4 of a second. Neil Allen was also racing in a self-entered McLaren Formula 5000 car, maybe not as well known as others on this list, but Neil Allen was a popular driver during a short motor racing career in the late 60s and early 70s, and took a popular win here in the New Zealand Grand Prix. What little information I can find on the man, he seemed to race in just about anything he can get his hands on, and was a major rival for Frank Matic. You rarely see one without the other. 1972, Frank Gardner. The 3-time British touring car champion Frank Gardner did race in Formula 1 in a customer Brabham, but without success. He did take a couple of podiums in non-championship Grand Prix, and he did win the New Zealand Grand Prix in a Works Lola, ahead of Mike Hailwood and David Hobbs. Frank Gardner was a renowned engineer and a talented racer who competed in motorsport until the 90s. He also won the European F5000 Championship, Sandown 500 and was runner-up in the European Formula 2 Championship. 1973 and 1974, John McCormack. The Australian won the New Zealand Grand Prix twice in the Australian-built Elfin Formula 5000 car. Whilst it was a pretty weak field in 1973, it did have some star power in 1974. McCormack beat Teddy Pillay and Peter Geffen, who were both racing chevrons. The second race was also the only New Zealand Grand Prix held at the Wigram Airfield Circuit. McCormack was a three-time Australian Drivers' Champion, but would never be known in Europe. He raced in both single-seaters and sedans, and even raced in the Bathurst 1000 in a Chevrolet Camaro, one of the first to do so. It was a disaster. 1975, Warwick Brown. I talked about Warwick Brown on this channel years ago. A Formula 1 one-race wonder with Walter Wolf Racing. Warwick Brown also won the Tasman Series in 1975, which would be the final one until 2021. Warwick Brown won in his Pat Burke Lola Chevrolet, dominating the field a lap clear of everybody else. He would go on to be a successful competitor in the Rothmans International Series, but if you really want more information about the man, then check out this video where I talk about him alone at length. 1976, 1990 and 2004, Ken Smith. We start part 2 with a man who has taken part in 50 New Zealand Grand Prix. Quite a feat on its own, but he has also won the race 3 times in 3 very different eras. I won't go through all 50 New Zealand Grand Prix Ken Smith has taken part in. We'd have to go from the mid-60s to the 2020s. But his first of the 3 wins was in a Lola Chevrolet, and the last race won under Formula 5000 rules. His second in 1990 was in a Swift Cosworth Formula Pacific, and his last in 2004 was in a Van Diemen Formula Ford. He took part in his final New Zealand Grand Prix, at least I think it'll be his final Grand Prix, in 2021 at the age of 80, which is really damn impressive. You rock, old man. 1977 and 1978, Keke Rosberg. The 1982 Formula 1 champion was just making his Formula 1 debut in 1978 with Theodore Racing, when he won the second of his New Zealand Grand Prix. Keke Rosberg won both races in a Chevron ahead of American Tom Gloy in 1977 and Larry Perkins and Danny Sullivan in 1978. He'd have a successful Formula 1 career with 5 wins and a title for Williams, and got to see his son Nico Rosberg take the Formula 1 crown in 2016, 34 years after Keke did the deed. Nico never won the New Zealand Grand Prix though. Maybe he should come out of retirement and give it a go. 1979, Teo Fabi. Italian Teo Fabi took the win for March ahead of Larry Perkins, who finished second once again. He was a March driver at the time in the European Formula 2 Championship, finishing third in 1980. He made his Formula 1 debut in 1982 for Tolman and took a couple of podiums for Brabham and Benetton, but spent most of his time jumping between the kart series and Formula 1, not committing to either. He was a race winner in karts, finishing runner-up in 1983 and starting the Indy 500 on pole. He also took a couple of podiums at Le Mans, winning the World Sports Car Championship in 1991. 1980, Steve Millen. After 30 years of the New Zealand Grand Prix, Steve Millen was only the 5th New Zealander to actually win it. Steve Millen started a run of 9 wins for Waltz, beating fellow Kiwi Dave McMillan and Formula 1 ace Andrea De Cesaris, who would be debuting in the big leagues with Alfa Romeo later that year. Steve Millen would move to America and race in a fair few major races, taking a class win at Le Mans in a Nissan 300ZX, as well as the IMSA GT Series. He won a class championship and the 12 Hours of Sebring in 1993, also in a Nissan, and raced in the IROC Series. He holds the record for most GTS wins in the IMSA, and also got work as an actor in commercials and as a stuntman. 1981, David McMillan. Up to this point, David McMillan had taken pole position and podiums in the New Zealand Grand Prix. Now he was finally winning it. The field was almost entirely made up of Australians and New Zealanders, with a single British entry for Reynard founder Adrian Reynard. David McMillan would follow his success in New Zealand by racing in America, finding some success in Formula Atlantic. 1982, Roberto Moreno. The popular Brazilian was a star in Australia and New Zealand before he became a Formula 1 driver. He won the Prix F1 Australian Grand Prix 3 times, often beating experienced Formula 1 talent in the process. He also won the New Zealand Grand Prix in 1982. For the first time it was run over 2 heats, and Roberto Moreno swapped a first and a second with Steve Millen, beating him on time by over 5 seconds. This same year Moreno would have his ill-fated drive with Lotus, which did untold damage to his career, before eventually making a number of appearances in Formula 1 with a host of backmarker teams and Benetton, taking wins in the kart series as late as 2000. Moreno remains one of the most popular race drivers ever. 1983, David Oxton. After a decade of competing in the New Zealand Grand Prix, David Oxton finally won it in 1983. There were a few Formula 1 drivers in the field, not really top tier guys. Alan Berg and Christian Danner didn't make the biggest splash in Formula 1. Paul Radicic was also in the field and finished second to Oxton, with Dave McMillan third. This was towards the end of Oxton's racing career, and outside of some appearances in touring cars, he didn't do a lot of note after winning the New Zealand Grand Prix. 1984 and 1987, Davy Jones. This kind of started a run of success for American drivers in the New Zealand Grand Prix. Davy Jones pulled 2 wins from his locker. The first in 1984 was ahead of a very small field, mostly made up of former winners like Ken Smith and David Oxton, who completed the podium, as well as David McMillan. Only 11 cars took part in 1987, Davy Jones winning ahead of Mike Fackwell and Ken Smith again. Jones has had a long, successful career. Considered for Formula 1 by Brabham in the mid-80s, he went on to make appearances in the kart series and won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1999 alongside Manuel Reuter and Alexander Wurz for Jost Porsche. He also finished second in the Indy 500 in 1996. He was still racing in sports cars in the mid-2000s. 1985 and 1986, Ross Cheever. The younger brother of Formula 1 driver and Indy 500 winner Eddie Cheever, Ross never managed to live up to his brother's successes, but he did find his own success, mostly in Japan. He also won 2 New Zealand Grand Prix. Both races had very small fields. Only 7 drivers finished in 1985 and 9 in 1986. Ross Cheever would win the Japanese Formula 3 in 1987 and stay in Japan for the next 7 years, finishing runner-up twice and third 3 times in a row between 1992 and 1994. He raced in America as well with a lot less success. 1988, Paul Radicic. British touring car legend Paul Radicic attempted the New Zealand Grand Prix a fair few times before finally winning it in 1988. Unfortunately, the results for the next few years seem to have been lost to time. He switched to touring cars in the 90s, never actually winning the British Touring Car Championship, but he did win the short-lived Touring Car World Cup twice and would go back to Australia to race in the V8 Supercars, retiring in the mid-2000s. 1989, Dean Hall. The last time an American won the New Zealand Grand Prix was Dean Hall in 1989. He was not the most impressive driver on the list, mostly having success in Australia in Formula Pacific. He raced in the kart series in 1990 but didn't do great, as well as part series in 1991 and 1995. He also raced in the IMSA until the late 90s. 1991, 1992 and 1993, Craig Baird. If New Zealand was the only country on earth, Craig Baird would be the greatest race driver in the world. His 3 wins in the New Zealand Grand Prix are just the tip of the iceberg of championships he's won in New Zealand, such as Formula Pacific, touring cars, Porsches, V8s, all multiple times. He also won a lot in Australia, but not in Britain. His one season in the British touring cars was shockingly poor. 1994, Greg Murphy. The enigma that is Greg Murphy won the New Zealand Grand Prix in 1994. Whilst he had a lot of success in New Zealand and Australia, he rarely ventured to other countries outside the odd GT appearance. He is most well known for his time in the Australian V8 series, where he was a regular race winner but never champion, finishing runner-up in 2003 and 2004. He did win the Bathurst 1000 4 times and the Bathurst 24 Hours with Peter Brock, Todd Kelly and Jason Bright. He has done some touring car racing in the years since, even winning championships in New Zealand in 2014 and 2015. 1995, Brady Kennett. After breaking his legs in a Formula Ford race in 1993, it must have been a dream come true for Brady Kennett when he won the New Zealand Grand Prix in 1995. Unfortunately, he never really progressed past national racing, returning to New Zealand Formula Ford by the late 90s and taking up truck racing shortly after. 1998 and 1999, Simon Wills. After a couple of years off, the New Zealand Grand Prix was won by Simon Wills to see out the 90s. The 1999 race was notable for having a couple of famous drivers in the field, namely 6-time IndyCar champion Scott Dixon and future V8 Supercars champion Craig Lowndes. Simon Wills would go on to have a pretty average career in touring cars, winning the second tier V8 title in 2001 and then spending a few years as a backmarker in the top series. He was done with motorsport by the mid-2000s. 2000, Andy Booth. The final driver we will look at today is Andy Booth, the final winner in a Formula Holden and the first of a new millennium. It was also the first time the series had returned to Pukekohe since 1991 and the final time the New Zealand Grand Prix would take place there to date. Andy Booth beat Matt Halliday and Paul Dumbrell and would later have touring car success in New Zealand, but nothing more. 2002, Fabian Coulthard. Well, there was no race in 2001, so we actually start with 2002, and the winner of that race was Fabian Coulthard. No relation to Scottish, big-chinned Formula 1 driver David Coulthard. This Kiwi was the first to win in a Formula Ford, beating American sports car legend Brian Sellers and Champ Car and NASCAR race winner AJ Allmendinger to the crown. After a couple of seasons in British Formula Renault, Fabian has spent the majority of his time in Australian V8s, taking 12 wins and a couple of podiums at Bathurst, and a Porsche Carrera Australia title. 2003, Johnny Reid. After a dominant New Zealand Grand Prix performance in 2003, Johnny Reid did go on to have a brief European career. He finished 4th overall in the 2004 Euro Formula Series, and even managed to finish runner-up in A1GP with Team New Zealand 2 seasons in a row. After that, he had a brief spell in America and returned to Australia for some V8 racing, never managing to grab hold of a stable full-time seat, and now races occasionally in GT and endurance racing. 2005, Simon Gamble. Possibly the least known driver on the list, won the New Zealand Grand Prix in 2005 but never left the realm of New Zealand Formula Ford, and his career seems to have stopped after 2006. 2006, Hamad Al Fadan. The only Bahrainian to win the New Zealand Grand Prix, possibly the only one to ever enter, was Hamad Al Fadan, who held off Daniel Gaunt and Brendan Hartley in 2006. This was the first time the Grand Prix was won under the Toyota Racing Series banner. Al Fadan mostly competed in Asia in the Formula BMW and Formula V6 series, of which he would be champion in 2009. He did also race in the British Formula 3 national class and even managed to get a drive in GP2 Asia, with a 5th place in Malaysia. After his 2009 Formula V6 win and run in GP2 Asia, he seems to have given up on motorsport in favour of being a musician, despite Kamui Kobayashi tipping him to be Formula 1's first Middle Eastern driver. 2007 and 2009, Daniel Gaunt. Two-time Toyota Racing Series champion Daniel Gaunt also won 2 New Zealand Grand Prix. He had a brief attempt at Champ Car Atlantic before his first New Zealand win, and after has mostly been racing in Australia in GT racing. He has had a few goes at V8 supercars over the years, but without much success, finding the odd win here and there, and is a decent steady hand in Australian and New Zealand GT racing. 2008, Andy Knight. Amazingly, Andy Knight beat Matt Halliday and Earl Bamber to win the 2008 New Zealand Grand Prix and has been a fixture in New Zealand racing ever since. Not really being a successful driver, he has raced for a long while in the New Zealand Muscle Series and various New Zealand touring car races. The New Zealand Grand Prix was the high point of his career. 2010, Earl Bamber. After finishing on the podium for the last couple of years, Earl Bamber finally won in 2010. This is where we get another jump in quality drivers. Whilst Earl Bamber's single-seater career is nothing special, he won 2 Australian Porsche titles, the Porsche Super Cup, 2 Bathurst 12-hour races, 2 24 hours of Le Mans wins, as well as a World Endurance title, Nürburgring, conquered, IMSA GT title, and is now part of Cadillac's World Endurance Hypercar and Corvette's IMSA GT programs, so more success is likely on the horizon for Mr. Bamber. 2011, Mitch Evans. The guy I keep predicting will win the Formula E title, and I'm sure he will win it eventually. Mitch Evans beat future Formula 1 driver Daniel Kvyat for the 2011 New Zealand Grand Prix win. A year later, he was GP3 champion as well, and then took 5 wins in 4 years of GP2. Since then, he has been racing for Jaguar in Formula E, taking 10 wins and spending the last few years as a real title contender who just can't take that last jump to win the title. 2012, 2013 and 2014, Nick Cassidy. Mitch Evans' current teammate at Jaguar in Formula E went one step further than Mitch Evans and won the New Zealand Grand Prix 3 times. Whilst he has taken a win in European Formula 3, he really made a name for himself in Japan, winning the 2015 Japanese F3 Series, 2017 Super GT and Super Formula in 2019. He has taken wins in the DTM and is now a top contender in Formula E, finishing runner-up to Jake Dennis in 2023, and after 2 rounds, leads the championship for Jaguar in 2024. He was also the last driver to win multiple New Zealand Grand Prix. 2015 Lance Stroll. Canadian Formula 1 legend Lance Stroll won the New Zealand Grand Prix nearly 10 years ago. The last time a driver who won the New Zealand Grand Prix and raced in Formula 1 was back in 1982, Roberto Moreno, so it had been a while. He would win the Formula 3 European Series in 2016 and would be a Formula 1 driver by 2017. First for Williams, then Racing Point and Aston Martin. He has taken 3 podiums in his 7 Formula 1 seasons, and in 2024 he had his best ever year, finishing in the top 10 in the championship for the first time ever. 2016 Lando Norris. And now the last driver to win the New Zealand Grand Prix and race in Formula 1 so far, Lando Norris. Amazingly, he has been a Formula 1 driver for a couple of years less than Lance Stroll, and yet has only finished outside the top 10 once in his debut year. He too won the Formula 3 European Championship and finished runner-up to George Russell in Formula 2. He began racing in Formula 1 for McLaren in 2018 and is now one of the top stars in Formula 1. 2017 Jehan Daruvala. Indian driver Jehan Daruvala looked like a star of the future himself in 2017. He made 2 attempts at the Formula 3 European Championship, but couldn't match the success of the previous 2 winners. He finished 3rd in Formula 3 in 2019 for Prema, and then spent 4 seasons in Formula 2 with Carlin, Prema and MP, and took 4 wins, but was never really in title contention. And with no Formula 1 drive forthcoming, and having been dropped by the Red Bull Academy, Daruvala is now in Formula E with Maserati. 2018 Richard Verschoor. The Dutchman is a highly underrated young driver, New Zealand Grand Prix winner ahead of Ferrari Academy driver Robert Schwartzman, and a year later he won the Macau Grand Prix also. He was mediocre at best in Formula 3, but since being in Formula 2 he has outperformed the cars he's given and taken 3 wins. He's not really a title contender, but he has been running consistently over the last few years. I doubt he'll get a chance in Formula 1, but I'm sure he'll have a strong career in motorsport, probably endurance racing. 2019 Liam Lawson. Oh yeah, he got to drive in Formula 1 as well, briefly. I guess he's the last New Zealand Grand Prix winner to drive in Formula 1 so far, briefly. This race was made easier when half the field were taken out mid-race in a large crash, with Lawson going on to win ahead of Marcus Armstrong. That being said, Liam Lawson has never actually won any championships outside the Toyota Racing Series. 2nd in Euro Formula, 2nd in the Toyota Racing Series in 2020, 2nd in DTM, 2nd in Super Formula. He's good, but it would be nice to see him win something outright. 2020 Igor Fraga. Brazilian Gran Turismo star Igor Fraga won the 2020 New Zealand Grand Prix and the Toyota Racing Series ahead of Liam Lawson. Whilst Liam Lawson has gone on to race in Formula 1, Fraga's career has been on a downhill slide ever since. He scored a single point in Formula 3 in 2020, then disappeared for a few years and resurfaced in Japan. He raced in Superlights in 2023 and will be in the secondary class of Super GT in 2024 for his 2nd season. He finished 23rd last year. 2021 Shane van Gisbergen. In the COVID hit year of 2021, a completely New Zealand field of old and young drivers took part in the New Zealand Grand Prix. V8 Supercars champion Shane van Gisbergen dominated the weekend. In the New Zealand Grand Prix, he pitted, went to the back of the field, overtook everyone, and took his first New Zealand Grand Prix win. It was one of the most incredible drives I've ever seen, and a year later I made him my race driver of the year. He also won a 3rd V8 Supercars title, 2 Bathurst 1000s, and won his NASCAR race debut in Chicago. Now he is in America, moving on to bigger things, as the Kiwi invasion of the United States continues. 2023 Lawrence Van Hopen. After a year off, the New Zealand Grand Prix returned in 2023 and was won by Lawrence Van Hopen, the next Dutch superstar, or one of the next Dutch superstars. He's had a couple of years in Formula Regional European and has been a top 10 runner, moving up to Formula 3 in 2024 with ART. 2024 Liam Skeets. The final driver on our list and the 50th different winner of a New Zealand Grand Prix is Liam Skeets. He's only been racing for a few years and the New Zealand Grand Prix is his most notable result, having finished 2nd in Formula Regional Japan in 2023 and the Formula Regional Oceania Series in 2024. I'm not sure what his plans are for the rest of the year. Maybe he'll return to Japan or follow Callum Hedges' moves by going to America, or maybe even try his hand at Formula Regional Europe. He might just be one driver you need to keep an eye on for the future. So that ends our look at all 50 drivers to have won the New Zealand Grand Prix from 1950 to 2024, from the likes of Sterling Moss and Jack Brabham, to Ken Smith and Greg Murphy, to the likes of Lance Stroll and Liam Skeets. It is quite a history. Just a shame so much of it is missing. A lot of winners are not very well documented, whole races have no information that is easy to find about them, and the first ever winner is a complete mystery to everyone. More needs to be known about the races that have gone missing from the history books. But for my part, thank you for watching the What Happened to Every New Zealand Grand Prix Winner Ever trilogy. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you once again for everything, and have a good one.